Welcome, friends and foes, survivors and killers. Let's sit around the campfire together and talk about Dead by Daylight. Specifically, the cult of the entity known as the Black Vale. A catalogue of their activities throughout Dead by Daylight's various stories, and a brief little look into what they might be doing next. Not too long ago, I made a video on the entity, the giant extra-dimensional parasite that is both the master of and is constituted from the realms, where Dead by Daylight survivors struggle against the killers in its service. The pages of the Observer tomes have given us huge amounts of details about the entity that have expanded upon what Dead by Daylight's old skeleton of lore set up for us all those years ago, in the game's earliest days. But today we'll be looking at a part of DBD's lore that's much newer than that, but that's become a sufficiently recurring plot element throughout DBD's recent stories that they've become almost much of a fixture of DBD's lore landscape as the entity itself. The Black Vale is a cult on Earth that worships the entity as a god, and have appeared in the backstories of survivors and killers alike for the past several years, and still making appearances continuously in the lore to this day. But I know a lot of people don't want to actually read the stories themselves. DBD's writing can be hard to get into at best, and actively obtuse at worst, especially given that the gameplay and the lore are not often integrated with each other outside of a few annual events. This is where I come in, the McDonald's line cook of DBD lore, processing these raw, indigestible messes into easily consumable chunks that it's probably not healthy to eat too much of at once. Today we'll be looking at the history of the Black Vale, both in terms of when Behaviour started writing about them, and at their in-universe history. We'll be examining the role they play in DBD's wider story that has allowed them to become a popular, recurring part of the game's storytelling, and what we might expect from the Black Vale in DBD's future stories to come. So let's wind back the clock to the first time that the Black Vale was alluded to in Dead by Daylight stories, and it's probably further back than you'd think at first. In Tome 1, the Observer logs present to us Arcus 1513, in which the Observer sees an image of an occult detective trying to prevent a ritual human sacrifice. The group sacrificing the victim is, according to the Observer, a cult worshipping the entity as a god. As we learned a year later when Binding of Kin released, that occult detective was a survivor, Élodie, and the cult was named in that story for the first time as the Black Vale. Well, multiple cults exist across multiple different universes, but you get the picture. The first time the Black Vale was directly integrated into a new character's release was with the Blight, who released in August 2020. Despite his story being focused for the most part on his work with the East India Company, once Talbot Grimes is thrown out of the company for excessive collateral damage, he's taken in by a group of mystics in a monastery that concealed a school of ancient lore and knowledge. Talbot learned of the entity and the occult under the tutelage of these mystics, deciphering their texts and scriptures to make sense of the nonsensical. But before he was able to fully utilise this information, the mystics kicked him out, sending him to rot in an opium den amidst the addled and neurotic ruins of his mind, only for the entity to scoop him up into the realms. Importantly, the mystics in this story are never explicitly referred to with the title of the Black Vale, and as such we don't know for absolute 100% sure that they are the Black Vale, but the more that we come to learn about the Black Vale and the modus operandi and other details that we get in future stories, the clearer in hindsight it became that these mystics are the Black Vale. They also had a role in the backstory of the Blight survivor Felix Richter, but their role in his life wouldn't be fully understood until the following chapter, A Binding of Kin, where the Black Vale first got their name and became a prominent force in DBD's lore for the first time. Both Élodie and the twins had the Black Vale playing a large role in their stories. After the execution of their mother, Charlotte and Victor were sold to the Black Vale, who spent the twins' preteen years conducting experiments on them, both scientific and arcane. We don't know fully the point of these experiments. It may have been to do with Charlotte and Victor's future as killers, or it may not, but regardless, when they were done, the Black Vale tried to sacrifice the two of them to the entity in a blood ritual. But thanks to some split-second action by Charlotte, and Victor choosing to set the building on fire, the twins managed to escape, albeit at the cost of Victor's life. The Black Vale would go on to hunt Charlotte the rest of her days in the real world, but even at rock bottom she was always able to keep herself and Victor's body safe. The twins even have an add-on, the Bloody Black Hood, that shows what happened to a Black Vale cultist who tried to recapture Charlotte. The Black Vale were a scourge on Charlotte and Victor's lives for years, but their presence continues to the modern day, where their worship of the entity changed the lives of two survivors, Élodie and Felix Richter. Felix and Élodie's parents were members of a group called the Imperiatti, a bunch of wealthy and powerful people from across the world who convened to try to help humanity against existential threats, such as the entity and its worshippers. their teenage children, including Felix and Élodie, met up to explore the island, forming a ragtag group called the Pariahs for their refusal or inability to integrate with the parent secret society. But one year, during a group meeting on Dire Island, a botched arcane ritual saw their parent disappear, leaving only the Pariahs behind. On the island, Élodie discovered a secret laboratory full of arcane research conducted by Talbot centuries prior, the same research that the Black Vale mystics had him replicate and develop under their custody. While Felix chose to run away from his parents' disappearances and live his own life, Élodie allowed the mystery of what happened to them to consume her life completely, and this brought her into conflict with the Black Vale on multiple occasions. Élodie would travel the world, collecting arcane artifacts and discovering occult practices, and the Black Vale would chase her around the world. But they didn't come to a proper confrontation until Élodie's exploration of the Paris catacombs led her down a path even darker than those tunnels. When she was down there, she witnessed an attempted human sacrifice, identified the Paris branch as part of a global cult, offering human lives to a great, unnamed old one. But before she was able to do anything about it, Élodie was attacked by a cultist. And no sooner was she able to escape by smashing a skull on the cultist's head did the entity scoop her from the ground and claim her for its own. This story, combined with Charlotte and Victor's, gave us our first concrete picture of the Black Vale as an organisation. They are a cult with global influence, who have been active for centuries and work in worship of the entity which they revere as a great old one, to whom they make regular human sacrifices, and this is a presentation of the cult that we find ourselves building upon as they appear in future stories. The next time the Black Vale popped up again was a year after the Twins' release, in the Portrait of a Murder chapter as a core part of the backstory of both characters. The killer, Carmina Mora, aka the artist, and the survivor, Jonah Vasquez. Both of these stories followed the manipulation and damage that clandestine activities have had historically on those in South America, which could almost pass for decent political commentary if it wasn't handled with all the grace and tact of a screening of Crash, a memorial for Princess Diana. Jonah's lore covers his work in the CIA in the present day, where his attempts to understand the Black Vale's activities with the power of math and gun are foiled by subterfuge and corruption at the highest levels of the agency, and a minor incident involving some civilians and quite a lot of bombs. Yeah, Jonah's lore is not the best, but it does give us a bit of context for the Black Vale's modern activities, and a brief insight into how deep the corruption runs into our modern institutions. In fact, this might be the only thing that Jonah's story approaches decently. Whatever he does, the CIA will brush away his misdeeds or anything that invites scrutiny under the rug, and does everything it can to ensure Jonah remains an asset rather than a liability, regardless of his personal ethics or choices. The CIA in Jonah's backstory is seeping with corruption, and much of it is implied to be because the Black Vale is infiltrating the ranks of its higher-ups, which resulted in Jonah's work being used to cover up or inadvertently assist with the Black Vale's agenda. Of course, it's still the CIA, they're still a fucked up organisation, but at least some of the evil isn't their fault, so I guess that's a win for them? But the truth of the relationship between the Black Vale and the CIA is most clearly seen in the story of his counterpart killer. Carmina's story takes place in Chile during the middle of the 20th century, which if you're familiar with real-life history or watch my video on it, you'll know was a turbulent time. In 1973, President Salvador Allende was overthrown by General Augusto Pinochet in a bloody coup that saw Chile under the thumb of a fascist government for decades, one backed by the CIA and then Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger. Side note, rest in piss, bozo. Yes, I know the coffin dance stopped being funny a couple of years ago, but come on, Kissinger deserves it, and he should have died long before now anyway. Carmina's story takes place during the early days of Pinochet's junta in Chile, and similar to many artists and political activists in Chile, she was being consistently monitored by powerful secretive forces to ensure that things never got out of hand. But while real-life Chilean dissidents had the secret police, the DINA, on their tail, Carmina's watchers were operatives of the Black Vale. VAC label. I've always hated that. The Black Vale are much more blatant with their activities in Chile than they have been in other stories, snatching Carmina and her friends away in the dead of night in a military operation almost. And this makes a lot of sense when you realize the authoritarian policies of Chile's government at the time. DINA was able to operate in Chile pretty much with impunity, so if someone disappeared, you generally assumed DINA or some other wing of the government was behind it, and you didn't question it, unless you really wanted to go missing yourself. So the Black Vale disappearing a prominent political activist pretty much came pre-packaged with its own excuse, that nobody has the means or authority to investigate too thoroughly. This goes for double if the Black Vale has managed to integrate itself directly into the ranks of the Chilean government or into DINA itself. since they'll have the official stamp of authority to do whatever they want to do, without any real consequences. And given the tie between the Chilean government at the time and the CIA, which the Black Vale has already been demonstrated in Jonah's law to have infiltrated, this seems very likely. The three-way connection between the Black Vale, the fascist Chilean government, and the CIA seems to be proven in Tome 12's story 12 to Midnight, The Crows, where a CIA operative called Luis is interrogated with what's implied to be Blight serum until he discloses what he did in Chile as an attempt to stop Carmina. Luis created propaganda throughout the mid-20th century that was designed to create dissent in countries opposed to US imperialism, to manufacture rebellion and control the narrative in favour of US interests. But in Chile at least, his options were hijacked by the Black Vale, who Luis claims were using the CIA as tools to help them gain a foothold in the country. For decades they controlled Chile through the CIA as well as through informants on the ground, such as Carmina's father who ended up selling her out to the Black Vale. This demonstrates the true reach and power of the Black Vale better than anything that we've seen so far. Their plans for the mass sacrifice of thousands of people span decades and rely on manipulation and corruption at all levels of society to get at the people that they believe are important, such as Carmina and her mother, who had the ability to perceive the overlap between the entity's realm and our own. Suppressing entire nations, overthrowing democracies, and installing tyrants like Pinochet are par the course for them because the shroud of authoritarianism allows their actions to go unscrutinised, and while Luis was making propaganda to overthrow Chile's democracy, the same mass manipulation by the Black Vale was also occurring on US soil. Roots of Dread told us the expanded story of a character we'd known about for years, the Doctor's mentor Otto Stamper, who's revealed to have been a part of the Black Vale's operations in the years before and possibly during his arrival at the Larry's Memorial Institute. In the 1960s, Stamper led a community of vagrants and social pariahs, no, not those pariahs, called the Fold, where good thinking mantras and indoctrination that definitely weren't brainwashing honest led to a community devoted entirely to Stamper and his words of wisdom. Wisdom. But stories began to abound of a formless nightmare creature called the Drawny, and Stamper decided to crack down on it with more authoritarian measures, promising the community would not be safe and happy until it was banished, going so far as to ban sleep so it couldn't infiltrate their nightmares. But this would not save them. If anything, it might have made it worse. And before long, the creature that we now know to be the Dredge slaughtered every single member of the commune and vanished into the darkness, leaving only Otto himself behind. Stamper's experience with mass manipulation and brainwashing would eventually lead the CIA to recruit him into the Larry's Memorial Institute, where he would mentor a young Yale graduate who was very, very interested in enhanced interrogation and mind control. Stamper's story shows us in practice what Luis had talked about in his interrogation in 12 to Midnight. Luis claimed that the Black Vale seeks to sacrifice not just individuals, but entire communities to the entity in the belief that this will cause them to transcend, whatever that means. And the destruction of the Garden of Joy seems to be an example of that mass sacrifice. What might seem from the outside to be a failure in policy was most likely a success by Stamper and the Black Vale criteria. If the Black Vale got what they wanted, the fate of the Ottomarians would likely be the fate of the entire world. It was also pretty neat to see the Doctor's law retroactively tied back into the Black Vale narrative. Shows that behaviour are willing and able to indirectly flesh their characters out, even if they were otherwise out of the main narratives because they released too early. And it makes me very excited for future releases that could potentially go back to basics to give us more from characters like Trapper and Nurse who could get some more depth. This leaves Forge and Fog as the most recent full chapter to relate directly to the Black Vale, with Vittorio's story revolving around exploring ruins and temples the Black Vale had left behind, and thus tying the Black Vale to Tardosh II by proxy. Vittorio led expeditions in search of the Lapis Paradisus, an ancient artifact reportedly capable of connecting the real world with the realm of the Observers, aka the realm of the entity. He finds clues in temples and ruins all across southern Europe and the Mediterranean, but especially in Greece, and he's driven to find the Lapis Paradisus because he believes it to be the key to accessing the Observers and bringing them back to Earth. He's right, but not in the way he wanted. And it turns out the stone's inscriptions are the ability to take Vittorio to the entity's realm, which is where he ended up. The one place even more terrifying than living in Italy. In any case, Vittorio's story hints at just how old the Black Vale is. Cult activity, worshipping the entity and directly communing with it, had existed long before it was found in the 13th century, since the ruins and temples Vittorio and his uncle found were ancient and abandoned even back then. It adds both to the Black Vale's mystery and to its strange arcane connections, and remains the oldest official mention of the Black Vale in DBD history, so who knows how far back it goes. Well, I think I've worked that out, but we'll get to that in a bit. Last mention that we have of the Black Vale so far came in a release I didn't expect to find it in. Nicolas Cage came out in August this year and came with a chunk of original lore that I guarantee nobody saw coming. We got to see the Black Vale in action once again, this time ensnaring everyone's favourite nouveau shamanic overactor. We even got to meet one Pauline Stamper, who appears to either be a descendant of the OG Otto Stamper from the 50s, or the modern day alternate version of him, managing the film set that she coaxes Nick Cage onto. You'd think it's kind of absurd that the evil entity cult seems to have a film department and dedicated film crew, but then you remember that they spent much of the 20th century making propaganda videos that have no reason to have stopped being made today, and it makes a lot more sense when you think about it like that. Beyond that, though, we knew that the Black Vale was still operating in the present day from Jonah and Élodie's lore, so it doesn't really add much new information other than the fact that Pauline Stamper exists, but it was nice to be reminded that the cult is still a major part of DBD's story, and that gets me excited for whatever story beats are still to come. Okay, so that's the immediate history of the Black Vale covered, but before we continue, I think we'd do a little bit of housekeeping. First things first, yes, I have in fact seen the reveal stuff for the casting of Frank Stone. And while I doubt that the Black Vale is directly involved in this story, I think the teasers are still really interesting, and I'll be going over them in the next video. And the second thing, there isn't going to be a potential problems video this month. Between casting and a special Christmas video that I've got planned, there just won't be time for one in December, and I'm sorry. For those who aren't aware, Potential Problems series is when I look back at a particular license that isn't in Dead by Daylight, explore the possibility of its survival by understanding what makes it tick, and usually design a power for whatever killer I believe the setting could offer. I've got a little list here of the 5 options for January's video, and you can vote for whichever one you want using the straw poll in the description. Our candidate killers are the Liquid Metal T-1000 Terminator from the Terminator series, the Repo Man from the sci-fi horror rock musical cult classic Repo the Genetic Opera, Dredge from the Depths of Rapture, a Big Daddy from Bioshock, the Star-Spangled Arsehole himself Homelander from The Boys and Gen V, and the definitive evil clown, Pennywise from Stephen King's It. Right now, Bioshock is winning, but the poll doesn't close until Christmas, so it's still all to play for, so get your votes in. And on that note, back to the Black Vale. So that's all the mention of the Black Vale so far in DBD's lore, and it paints a pretty interesting timeline, one that starts in ancient Greece and continues to the present day, with clandestine operations, mass sacrifices, and the cover of authority and political power to enact a horrifying agenda in the entity's service. But there is one big question. Where did it all get started? I think I might have the answer, but fair warning, this involves diving into a little bit of a theory that I've had for a while, so be warned that this bit hasn't been canonically confirmed, to take it with a grain of salt. But did anybody else notice a slightly out-of-place part of Vittorio's lore? As Vittorio explores the world looking for clues to find the Lapis Paradisus, he finds script in a Greek temple, written in Sanskrit and Akkadian cuneiform. Which is weird, because European explorers and linguists hadn't even started to translate Sanskrit until the 17th century, and Akkadian cuneiform wouldn't take another 100 years to start to crack. How Vittorio and his uncle Renzo managed to translate the text that Western scholars wouldn't be able to translate for another 400 years is hand-waved away in the story. What really interests me is what Akkadian cuneiform and Sanskrit script, language from the Middle East, is doing in a Greek temple. Vittorio's lore does directly allude to a dark cult which we can all but assume is the Black Vale, so they're definitely present in the story to some capacity. But that doesn't explain how writing that's so old, and in a language that comes from so far away, could have made its way to Greece for Vittorio to find. And this, I believe, has some clues as to the Black Vale's origins. Where have we seen Akkadian and Sanskrit language before in Dead by Daylight? Well, the obvious place to look is in the Plague's lore. Sanskrit and Akkadian were both common languages spoken or written in ancient Babylonia, and that's where she's from. Even the giant prayer tablets in the Temple of Purgation are written in Akkadian cuneiform. Much like the Black Vale, Adiris took part in human sacrifices and offerings of flesh and blood to her gods, and her story ends with her travelling into the Urashtu woodlands with her followers and begging the gods to save them. This is where the entity answers her prayers by stealing her away to become a devoted killer in the trials. But we never learn what actually happened to the followers who came with her to Urashtu. The story claims that her followers were never seen again, and many believe they were taken to Rome with the entity. But I have another theory. I believe that Adiris' former followers became the first Black Vale cultists. It all started right there, in that cave, when these sick and desperate people witnessed a miracle. I think what happened here was the entity allowing them to live, similar to the plague herself. Their bodies were still damaged by the infection, but they were given the strength to keep living normal lives regardless, and they took this dark miracle as the sign to spread worship of the new Great Old One across the world, offering more sacrifices to it, just like Adiris had offered herself to it. It would explain a lot, including how Sanskrit and Akkadian texts appeared in the Greek temple. In the 8th century BC, a not particularly long time after Adiris' time, the Greeks began their Orientalizing period, where they adopted elements of culture and mythology from places like Mesopotamia. There are a lot of elements of Greek astronomy, religion and mythology that started out in Babylonia. Entity worship and the Black Vale cult could have been one of the things that left Babylon and arrived in Greece during that time, explaining how script written 2,000 years before Vittorio found it could have wound up in that Greek temple. It would explain why the Black Vale does human sacrifice, because that's what Adiris did. It would even explain the black cloaks and the cowls they wear, because as plague survivors and former carriers, they'd have needed to integrate properly into societies, and to do so they'd need to wear large dark clothing that covers their faces, so that anybody getting suspicious or frightened of their sickness. Forgive my tinfoil hatting here, but it all fits together a little bit too cleanly for this possibility not to at least be considered. Tell me what you think of the theory in the comments, or if you have any ideas of your own about the origins of the Black Vale. So with that, what do you think will be next up for the Black Vale? Well, it's safe to say that I don't think their story's over yet. The last original release that we had contained more Black Vale lore for Nick Cage, and at the very least we know the next survivor coming in the mid-chapter, and the next full chapter after that will both be original. So we're very, very surprised if neither of them contained any connection to the Black Vale at all. And even if they don't, we've almost certainly got another tome story coming in the January mid-chapter that will contain lore for older characters too. My money's on Deathslinger and Zarina, and Deathslinger especially gives us a great chance to look at the institutional power of the Black Vale, how it turns corruption, baked into other organisations like the CIA or potentially the private prison system, into a tool for its own ends. But what I'm most excited for is the other two original killers who have yet to receive tome stories. Both the artist and the Dredge have strong existing connections to the Black Vale, and any tome story that they get is likely to expand on those connections. Hell, Carmina got one section in 12 to Midnight that gave us more Black Vale goodness than her entire chapter had done before it. Imagine what she could do with a full tome to herself. And Dredge isn't really a creature with enough sapience to explore as a character, so I suspect that Dredge's tome will be given over to Otto Stamper, and the perspective that could give us into the Black Vale's inner workings from someone who clearly trust to act in their interest would be fascinating. The kind of thing that we just haven't seen before. Of course, beyond this, there is a ton of possibilities. We could easily see a killer or even survivor directly affiliated with the Black Vale, like an actual cult member or something. Also additional tome stories for older characters later down the line, like Doctor, to retroactively tie their stories properly to the Black Vale, and these sticky fingerprints is left throughout the history books. I'm sure a couple of you are asking right now, why should we care? The Black Vale doesn't have a direct impact on the game itself for now, they're just background dressing. We didn't need them in the story back when DBD started, so why do they matter so much now? Well, the Black Vale provided something that's pretty important to preserve the longevity of DBD storytelling. They allow the entity to engage with the real world outside of the realms in ways that are far more interesting than it could do without them. Just look at, say, the backstory of every survivor from the original 4, all the way up to Zarina, and you'll see a broad pattern emerging. They're all broadly decent people leading broadly decent lives before the incident happens and the entity scoops them up. It's a possible formula, but it's basic, inflexible, and gets old quickly, to the point that if you're not trying to play with something unique and specific, like Yunjin's clean self-preservation instincts, or Tarita and Hanato's sibling dynamic, the stories can often feel homogenized over time. Adding something larger at play, not even in every story, but just in a fair few of them, gives the characters more to do by giving them a third thing that they in their lives can interact with. Themselves, the world they grew up in and that they're used to, and an intruder to that world in the form of the Black Vale and its machinations. The use of the entity directly as this intruder in the Black Vale's place would cheapen it in my opinion, especially with repeated use. It also allows adversarial forces in entity-related stories to be feasibly defeatable. Élodie defying the entity wholesale in an encounter in the Paris catacombs would be strange for a regular person to be able to do on their own. But defeating a Black Vale operative and eluding capture for years, that's impressive but doesn't really proffer too many questions that are difficult to answer. The Black Vale allows the entity to maintain distance needed for a vast cosmic horror story to remain threatening, whilst allowing it to be functionally present in a story, and it lets personal stuff happen that would seem out of place without the entity's human intermediaries. Carmina, for example, couldn't be sold out directly to the entity by her father. I'm pretty sure the realms don't have a good phone connection, but the Black Vale will certainly be willing to take that call. The Black Vale provides an invaluable role in the wider DBD story. They make the entity a very personal and immediate threat to everyone on the worlds they threaten. Not just the unlucky individuals handpicked by the entity, but all the others whose suffering they cause as part of their manipulations. They are everywhere, they are very, very powerful, and nobody knows what they could do next. But I, for one, am looking forward to finding out. That's all I have to say for now about the Black Vale, at least until some other story comes out probably in the new year, and that's going to be a fun time, I'm sure. What do you think about my theory of the Black Vale's origins, or do you have any other theories about the mysterious cult? I would love to hear them. Do drop them in the comments if you feel like getting them read. I do read all my comments, so. And while you're down there, feel free to subscribe if you want to catch the next video. It'll be covering the casting of Frank Stone, which has had some interesting previews, and I want to take a look at them and take some guesstimations ahead of the release next year. Don't forget, the Community Potential Problems poll is still going on right now, so do hop in and make your vote count, because I would love to hear what you guys want to see in January. Remember to get that vote in at the straw poll in the description. And on that note, I'll see you in the next video. Ta-ta for now.